Ernie Anderson here. We'd like tonight to interview probably one of the most outstanding personalities in the Cleveland area and maybe of our time, Goulardi.
Oh.
And I'm sure it's going to be a lot of laughs. Good evening. Ernie Anderson here. We'd like tonight to interview probably one of the most outstanding personalities in the Cleveland area and maybe of our time, Goulardi.
Oh.
And I'm sure it's going to be a lot of laughs.
Group, it's going to be a good night. So cool it.
In 1963, think of the remarkable things that were going on in the United States. You had urban flight, you had space flight, you had civil rights, you had all these remarkable things that were happening. Cleveland was the 8th biggest city in the world. But all of a sudden, this character comes on TV on Fridays and just by word of mouth becomes the biggest thing to hit Cleveland.
Kids today would have no understanding of what television was like, comparatively speaking, because there were 3 channels, 3, 5, and 8. There was more local programming than there is today.
50s, 60s was this golden age of every market of any size. If you were big enough to have a TV station, it was likely you did at least one children's show. Children's shows were local phenomena.
This is a point in television when, to a large extent, if you've got a TV license, you're going to be able to make money.
Keep in mind, when Goulardi hit the air in 1963, TV had only been around for 16 years. We went on with on the air with the national anthem. We went off the air after the Milkman's Matinee with the national anthem, and the screens would go dark for a number of hours.
KYW is a subscriber in good standing to the television code and is privileged to display the seal of good practice. This is Tom Field inviting you to tune in Channel 3 tomorrow at 9 a.m.
But by the late 1950s, more and more TV stations were thinking about staying on the air after their local news had ended. Then the 1956 TV airing of the original King Kong drew 90% of the TV audience. TV took notice. And in 1957, Screen Gems released a scary package of old monster movies just for TV.
But in 1957, Universal released all their library of old horror films as a package called Shock Theater. And they released it to syndicated them, so in individual markets, people could buy this package. So they sent out these movies, and it was Dracula and Frankenstein, all the old Lugosi and Karloff films. And this reintroduced, very important, by the way, to the pop culture history, because this reintroduced a whole generation to these wonderful movies. But it also presented the problem to the stations that bought them. How do we present them? And that's when the horror host came along.
A miracle of chemistry, or maybe alchemy would be a better word, would happen. You'd have these really bad horror films, and these even worse kind of, hosts. And somehow when they came together, it was something perfect. It was something beautiful.
Beautiful? Okay, maybe the good Dr. Thompson has watched too much TV. The original Shock Theater package consisted of what Screen Gems considered to be 52 of the goriest films of the Universal monster movies. Soon, the films were on in more than 90 cities across the U.S., earning high ratings and creating local stars. Ernie Anderson was born in Boston in 1923. He grew up in the suburbs of Lynn and Lawrence. As a youngster, Ernie's parents sent him to elocution school, where he struggled to memorize Casey at the Bat. It was clear early on, memorization just wasn't his thing. Anderson recalled this in a 1996 interview with Cleveland reporter Michael Shufsky.
And I can't remember never could, and now I really can't,
By the time Ernie graduated high school in 1942, most men his age were being drafted into the service for World War II. Hoping to avoid being drafted into the Army, Ernie volunteered to serve in the Navy. After the war, one of Anderson's professors at Suffolk University told him he thought he had a great voice for radio. With no experience but that voice, Anderson was able to get his first job in radio in Vermont. Then he was quickly fired when he made fun of an advertiser for singing in a barbershop quartet. Anderson lost his next radio job in Rhode Island because he had to ride his motorcycle into the station's offices. He finally came to Cleveland in 1959 to work at WHK Radio, but he left WHK when the station started playing rock, which Anderson hated. Finally, in 1960, he landed a gig at Channel 3, then known as KYW-TV. There, Anderson would work with two Cleveland kids, Tim Conway and Chuck Shadowski.
But while I was at Channel 3, the booth announcer there was Ernie Anderson. And he had one of his buddies there named Tom Conway. And I got to know Ernie better than Tom, who became Tim.
Anderson and Shadowski moved to WJW-TV8 after a year or so. Anderson was hired to host a movie show called Ernie's Place, but he wanted Conway to come along from KYW to help write segments and play wacky characters on camera. So he had to convince WJW executives to hire Conway away.
Tom supposedly, as a director, which he never did, Ernie lied about that. Ernie wanted him there to help him write the funny stuff for a show called Ernie's Place, which aired in the afternoon.
Tim had an offbeat sense of humor, and Ernie did as well, and that really meshed on the Ernie's Place movie show, and in which Ernie would interview Tim, and Tim, who was then Tom, would assume a variety of character roles in really deadpan fashion.
But Ernie's Place, like so many of Anderson's on-air gigs, didn't last long. A tape of Conway and Anderson's shtick was noticed by Steve Allen from The Tonight Show. Allen loved Conway, but figured he could do the straight man's part played by Ernie. Conway headed out to L.A. and stardom. Ernie, well, he stayed behind in Cleveland, and by 1962, Ernie's Place was history. Anderson was once again spending his days as booth announcer for WJW. Then, in late 1962, WJW management decided to dust off its package of shock movies and give it a second try. The station had already tried to create a late-night host for a few weeks in the summer of 1958. The horror host then? Pete Myers as the Mad Daddy. Myers was a former colleague of Anderson's from WHK Radio, but the Mad Daddy never took off.
Ernie was still under contract, so the station had to pay him another year anyway, so they said, this is in '63. They said, we want you to be a horror host. And he said, what will I do? He said, just have an accent and talk about the movie. And so that's how Gallardi was born.
January 1963 was a record cold, snowy month and period in Cleveland. And TV viewership was especially high because the city was in a long newspaper strike that continued until spring. So there wasn't any kind of coverage of, initially of Ghoulardi becoming a sensation. Well, the show started in January 1963, Shock Theater with Ernie hosting as Ghoulardi.
Here's this package of horror movies. You need to have a host. And then what kind of host are you going to have?
Good evening, little kids. You know, that kind of Count Floyd type of thing that they had going. Well, Ernie was kind of so laid back, it was almost like, come on in and see what you...
Instead of like trying to scare kids, he's just goofing on things.
WJW's Shelley Saltzman went to local makeup artist Ralph Gulko for help in creating the look of Ghoulardi. The beard, the glasses, everything came together.
And he said the reason he put that beard and mustache on is because he had this voiceover gig going. He had a good career going. He just didn't want anybody to know who it was. He thought it would ruin it. But hey, for an extra $75 a week, he'll do Ghoulardi.
Cleveland was a little bit behind the curve with Ghoulardi because really 57 was the first big boom of the horror hosts. But when it got, Ernie made up for lost ground awfully fast. So it became one of the best known of the horror hosts.
All right, regarding Ghoulardi's show, same stinks. Show good, knock the nut. Written by the adults. All right. Seems to me an adult could write a better telegram than that, right? Hey, boy, magic disappeared.
Ghoulardi aired on Fridays right after city camera news ended on WJW. At first, the station paid little heed to the show, and Ernie liked the freedom of the late-night gig.
And no one was really paying a whole lot of attention to who was watching or what was being said, at least at first.
The late-night time slot also allowed Ernie's supporting cast, now including Big Chuck as director, a chance to experiment.
I came up with that circle, and then later I modulated the circle, and I came up putting him in the film, and I'm just enjoying the heck out of it, picking the music for stuff. And
left alone in the WJW studios late on Friday nights, Anderson and Shadowski were brewing up a big pot of crazy that would soon explode. Anderson's Ghoulardi would take off with baby boomers in Northeast Ohio who had never seen anything like it. And Ghoulardi would come to be part of what it meant to be from Cleveland.
People of a certain age, you can actually identify. It's like a secret code. It's like a special handshake. If they know who Garfield Goose is, you know they grew up in Chicago. If they know who Ghoulardi is, you know they grew up in Cleveland. Every bit as much as a cheesesteak identifies Philadelphia, these kids' programs really did mean something to the definition of what it meant to be from Kansas City or from New York or any of these places. And in the case of the smaller markets, that was kind of a big deal. This was your in touch with showbiz. All the big shows were made in LA or in New York or in maybe Chicago in the early days. But when it came to this local stuff, this was the one place where TV was actually happening.
WJW had put Ghoulardi on the air with a package of old horror movies. But by 1964, it would be the other stations in town that would be gasping in horror as Ghoulardi went from a joke to the king of Cleveland. Within a few months, Ghoulardi had become a huge, monstrous hit. Anderson's ratings soared. At one point, Ghoulardi was earning a 27 rating. The Tonight Show was the next closest with a 7.